we all know that core values shape the values we place on foods, and these could be, because of the taste or nutrition, or because of the emotional benefit that we get with sharing food with individuals. And also, our food values that are developed throughout the life course shape our food preferences. And preferences remain important to nursing home residents throughout, their environment, even though their environments may impact the fulfillment of those food preferences. And so one of the things that we know is important is that the knowledge of food preferences could help nursing home providers address nursing home quality concerns. And one of the things that we know that we see a lot of providers are concerned about their meals and dining resident and family satisfaction scores. And so this was one of the things that led us to look into this topic. And so first I'm joined by Amy Cotterman, and she is a registered dietitian and licensed dietetic. She graduated from The Ohio State University with a Bachelor of Science degree in Medical Dietetics. She is the Director of Hospitality Services for United Church Homes, where she has been employed for 27 years. She is a member of the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, Dietetics in Healthcare Communities, the Ohio Retail Food Safety Advisory Council, and is the current chairman of the Ohio Healthcare Association Dining and Nutritional Services Council. She was the 2016 recipient of the Distinguished Member Award for Dietetics in Healthcare Communities. Amy serves as a long-term care preceptor for the Medical Dietetics Program for The Ohio State University, as well as a member of their Medical Dietetics Advisory Board. She's a frequent presenter for the Ohio Healthcare Association, Core of Knowledge, and is a guest lecturer on nutrition and aging for Heidelberg University and the Ohio State University, and we are delighted to have her join us. Our second presenter is Chelsea Goldstein, and Chelsea is a graduate student in social gerontology at Miami University, and she is in her second year of working on the PELI project. She's worked on many facets of the project, including working with local providers, conducting PAL card work, contributing to local, state, and national conferences, and leading the team on the team's research on food preferences. Prior to pursuing her graduate degree, she worked as a research assistant in the gerontological social work at the University of South Carolina, where she worked on several nationally funded projects in the areas of person-centered care, culturally competent care, and gerotechnology. During this time, she also served as a project coordinator for a person-centered, culturally competent end-of-life program in South Carolina. After her time in South Carolina, she spent 3 years working in home care, where she led business development and operations for 2 small home care agencies in Maryland. Her perspectives on gerontology and person-centered care are shaped by her experiences in both academia and in the provider arena. And again, we're delighted to have them both. And this is a series that we do. It's part of a quarterly series we host to disseminate findings from our research and collaborators with a variety of stakeholders. And then without further ado, I want to go ahead and turn it over to Chelsea, who's going to start telling us more about the topic of today's webinar.
Thanks, Katie. Hello, everybody. This is Chelsea. I'm just so excited to be a part of this today. So we'll get started by talking about some of the objectives of the webinar. And so our first objective is to really make sure that participants understand some of the common barriers to fulfilling food preferences in nursing home settings, and also some of the common reasons that food preferences may change in different settings or in different situations. We also hope that you will learn how the most updated dining regulations really do promote person-centered dining practices. And lastly, we would really like to help participants receive some guidance on implementing person-centered dining practices and some strategies, and talk about some strategies to overcome the barriers that may come up during implementation. And so I will go ahead and start by reviewing the results of a study that we did here at Miami University. And that study identified some of the common barriers to fulfilling food preferences of nursing home residents, and it also identified some of the major reasons preferences may change in different situations. And so then I'll hand it over to Amy, and she'll go over how some of the current regulations promote person-centered dining, and she'll also be talking about some of those implementation strategies. So just a little bit of an overview of the advice we're providing today. The recommendations we're presenting are based upon the experience and expertise of over 15 years of development, testing, and implementation of the PELI-NH in various organizations. And as Katie mentioned, we are collaborating with Amy Cotterman of United Church Home, so she brings her 27 years of experience to this webinar as well. And our primary goal really is to assist you in practicing honoring food preferences and cultivating that culture of person-centered dining in your communities. So in collaboration or in connection with the webinar, we developed a tip sheet and we sought some feedback from our advisory panel of providers. And that's just one more resource that helps you kind of review some of these implementation strategies for person-centered dining. And that tip sheet was shared in our January newsletter, and I believe you received the link to the updated version of the tip sheet in conjunction with this webinar. So the first big question is, what is person-centered dining? So person-centered dining is really ensuring that residents' needs and choices are central to the dining experience. And it also provides meaningful choice to residents. So, for example, offering a resident one meal choice and an alternative likely won't feel like a very real choice to them. And in fact, some participants in our study that we'll talk about in a few minutes talked about how this kind of choice really felt like no choice at all. And so instead, meaningful choice is considering residents' food preferences, including where, when, with whom they like to eat, and incorporating these preferences into choice options as much as possible. Person-centered dining is also encouraging residents to participate in the care planning process regarding food and dining. And really, residents should be at the center of their own dining experiences and food planning processes. And we also know that residents may have some preferences that could be risky to their health safety. Maybe they really prefer a food that's not on their diet plan. So person-centered dining is really working with the resident to navigate these risky food preferences and finding a balance between honoring the resident's preference and helping them do so in a reasonably safe way. And so this is a diagram from Pioneer Network. And I think that it just really illustrates the concept of person-centered dining very well. And as you can see, the resident is at the center of all of these processes. And the diagram also shares an excerpt from a paper that makes a really kind of nicely stated point. And it says, simply speaking, it's all about choice. Choice of what to eat, when to eat, where to eat, whom to eat with, how leisurely to eat, true choice, not token choice. So that really reinforces this idea of meaningful choice and how important it is to give individuals true choice in their dining experiences. So another big question is, why is person-centered dining such a hot topic lately? And I think as Katie quickly mentioned at the beginning of our webinar, we really hear about and see research on the fact that dining tends to be ranked pretty low in terms of resident satisfaction. And we suspect a lot of that reasoning is because residents feel their preferences are not being met. And so person-centered dining can really help honor some of those preferences and in turn improve satisfaction. And the Pioneer Network also makes a strong case for moving away from institutional dining. In one of their resources, they say institutional meal delivery contributes to food waste and then high-cost nutritional supplements to make up for what isn't eaten. This is also a hot topic because there have been relatively recent changes to regulations about dining that really do promote person-centered dining, and Amy will talk about these in more detail a little bit later on. And ultimately, it's a really important topic because food really is central and meaningful to all of our lives. So if you just take a really quick minute, think about food in your own life. You probably will be able to very quickly come up with some memories about a favorite food or a holiday celebration that involves food, a family recipe, things like that. And so that's no exception for people who live in residential communities. And so this last quote on the slide was pulled from our study, and somebody said, in response to our questions about food preferences. Food is the highlight of anyone's day, and when you can't look forward to it, it's awful. And they said that's a real bone of contention. So that quote really inspired the title of our study, and the study was titled A Bone of Contention, Perceived Barriers and Situational Dependencies to Food Preferences of Nursing Home Residents. And that was just one of many, many really powerful statements that we heard from residents in this study regarding their food preferences and how they felt they were or maybe were not honored in their communities. So to look at this issue in a more systematic way, we focused on 3 study objectives. And the first was to really look at some of the environmental and personal barriers to important food preferences of nursing home residents. And the second was to explore some of the rationale behind why important food preferences may change in different situations. And the last major objective was to explore the reasons food preferences were fulfilled. So for this study, we interviewed 255 nursing home residents, and they lived in 28 provider communities. And they provided 984 total comments when they answered 6 food preference questions that are on the PELI NH. So these food preference questions are: how important is it to you to choose what you eat, choose when you eat, choose where to eat, have snacks available between meals, order takeout food, and eat at restaurants. And so what we did is we recorded these comments verbatim, and then we sort of categorized them into different categories using qualitative data analysis strategies. So the first way something could be categorized is that it was not categorized as anything. It was not preference congruence, a barrier, or a situational dependency. And we'll get into what these terms mean in just a second. Next, the comment could have been categorized as preference congruence. So what this means is that somebody mentioned that they had an important preference and that they felt that that preference was being fulfilled in their community. A comment could also be categorized as a barrier. So this would be something that would prevent somebody from fulfilling a preference, or they perceived that it prevented them from fulfilling an important food preference. And the last way something could be categorized was a situational dependency. And so this was a reason that a food preference changed in different situations. And when we looked at the barriers and situational dependencies, we further categorized them in 4 different environments. So the first is the provider environment. So these are things like facility policy or provider schedule, and these may be reasons that individuals felt that their food preference could not be fulfilled. We also looked at within-person environment. So these are things that are more focused on the personal level. So maybe somebody perceived that their health status was a barrier to fulfilling a food preference. We also looked at social and global environment, but none of the comments mapped into those categories. So in the study, we had 18 communities that participated that were nonprofit. We had 9 for-profit communities and 1 government community. And the participants, some demographic information on them, they lived in their provider communities an average of 924 days. They had a mean age of 81. They had an average MMSE score of 25, and the majority of them were white, widowed, female, and had high school education. And so of the 984 comments that were provided in response to the food preference questions, about 39% of them mentioned barriers. About 6% of them mentioned reasons preferences changed, or what we called situational dependencies. And about 10% of them mentioned that they felt their important preferences were being fulfilled. And so let's take a little bit closer look at some of these comments. So we'll start with some of the barriers that came up. And facility policy did tend to be a barrier that a lot of participants perceived as being something that prevented them from fulfilling their important food preferences. So some of the comments that we read during this study, things like, the same foods are served each month and there is not enough of a variety. A lot of times sarcasm resonated around what they felt was not really a very good choice. They said things like, choice of two, big choice. And many participants felt that the staff and the residents go by the rules, in comments like, they tell us when, go by what they tell me, and it's their rules. And scheduling also came up as a common barrier in the provider environment. So residents said things like, if you don't show up, you don't eat. We are the last feeding here. They don't care about us. They feed us like animals. And some people did talk about how they feel like staff have to do it, meaning serve food or create a dining experience when they can do it, as there are too many people. Another barrier that did come up in the provider environment was perceived staff proficiency. So this is when people felt that staff proficiency was a reason that their preferences were not fulfilled. Somebody said they got a new chef, but it doesn't seem to be working. I don't think it's the chef, I think it's the workers that don't follow orders. And another person said, kitchen is lousy, no experience, boss should be in earlier to check on workers, they never correct issues. So now we'll move into some of the barriers that came up in that within-person environment, and one of the major ones was functional ability. So people felt that their functional ability prevented them from fulfilling some of these important preferences. So they explained how some of the communities had bus trips, but many residents described the process of getting out as too involved. And somebody said from getting dressed to getting the walker in the car. Other people felt like they needed wheelchair assistance, and one person was confined with oxygen. And this is related to the functional ability, but many people felt that they perceived the social acceptability of their functional complications as very embarrassing. And they said things like, I have to be fed, I have difficulty walking, or I'm afraid of my bowels letting loose. And they often said these things regarding going out to eat in restaurants or eating around other people. And a final barrier in that within-person environment is the level of personal resources. So a few people explained that they only received $45 per month, and that just doesn't get very far. Another resident indicated that they needed to be put on the trip list to get to restaurants, and another stated that she would like to eat out, but she needs somebody to get her out. And takeout was considered difficult to attain because you need somebody to bring it in. So now we'll talk about some of the reasons that the participants said their preferences changed in different situations. And so one of those major reasons was perceived personal health. So they may have a preference in one situation when they felt their personal health was one way, and that may change if they felt their personal health was a different way. So many people said they change their snacking preferences if they don't want to gain weight. And regarding where to eat, 6 residents made similar comments to the comment, I always eat in the dining room, or if not feeling well, in my room. And another reason preference changed was the type of non-staff relationship. So many residents talked about how they only ate out if they go out with their family. And one resident even mentioned that she recently turned down a lady who wanted to take me out because she did not desire the woman's company. So through this study, we really realized that food is a bone of contention for many people. But we also know that this is an incredibly challenging area for administrators and staff. You have to balance a variety of preferences and staff schedules and individual diets, and this can be incredibly overwhelming and a huge amount of work and a huge undertaking. But we also wanted to investigate some times that preferences were fulfilled, because we think that it's important to help providers recognize what they are doing well, and it also may provide some insight or some ideas on how providers could adapt things that they are currently doing to make them even better. So here are a few things that some of the participants said regarding preference fulfillment. So a resident did not mind the facility policy about where to eat because she was assigned to a table with her friend. some residents talked about how they were able to retrieve snacks from a cart that goes around, or a snack bar, or a snack closet in the living room. And several residents mentioned comments about how being able to retrieve snacks was really important from locations and times that they felt were convenient to them. Residents were also satisfied with sort of the routine in their communities when it corresponded with established habits. So, for example, some of them talked about how they were content with a 5 o'clock dinner time because that time corresponded to their meal times at home. So some takeaway points that we gathered through all of these comments. So first is that residents who perceived a lack of food choice may have really preferred to employ their own independence and their creativity in decision-making. So some research in the area of values really demonstrates that we all are kind of guided by these core set of values in our everyday activities and in our preferences, and that does include our food preferences. So one of these values is self-direction, and that's where people value choice. They value independence. They value being able to use their creativity to problem solve. And it could be that these residents who thought that they didn't have a choice over what to eat felt that they weren't able to exercise that self-direction. We also found that the majority of participants who complained about poor food quality connected it to staff proficiency. And so this really indicates that food service may be as equally important as food quality. Another interesting takeaway was that the residents who regularly talked about the people who make the dining rules, they regarded them as they and them. And that really conveyed that they weren't sure who was creating these environments in which they were eating. And so as a result, they felt kind of removed from these very intimate processes of eating and dining. And we also know that food is just so much more than eating for sustenance. It's how we connect with each other. It's how we celebrate holidays and good times. And it can even be a way that we all kind of deal or cope with less positive feelings. And so not knowing who is kind of in charge of your dining experience, we can see how that could feel disconnecting for some of these residents. Thank you. Our study also showed that understanding residents' food preferences could give providers some more insight into how individuals prioritize their different food values. We all will have conflicts that arise within us at one point or another regarding food. So kind of a common one could be that we may like to eat snacks, but we don't want to gain weight. And so how a resident works through that decision could help providers understand what is most important to that resident, and then providers can really work to find ways to support that resident through those food-related decisions. We also found that for many people, the level of interest in eating out was really dependent on the companionship. Many of the participants indicated that they only like to eat in restaurants with certain people, particularly family members. So that goes back to this idea, again, that I think we've kind of mentioned a few times now, that food is so much more than eating. It's just really this vehicle of connection. And that's so, so important and so critical, I think, to these food preferences and these food choices. And so one more thing that we found was that food values are often shaped early in life, and they may continue when a resident moves into a nursing home. And there's one theory that we have in gerontology, and it argues that we don't all of a sudden change our values when we get older, and that everyone kind of has some change over the years, but that for the most part, our values and our interests stay relatively constant throughout our lives. And the research on sort of food preferences indicates that some of these food values are cemented really early in life. And so kind of one example of this could be somebody may love meatloaf because their mom cooked meatloaf every Sunday for them when they were a child, and that's like an important memory that they've held on to. So as far as this study goes, we felt that we learned some really invaluable information from talking to these residents and really getting some deeper insight into their food preferences. But like all studies, it has some limitations. So it did not include those who have severe cognitive impairment or an MMSE score less than 13. We did meet our recruitment goals for individuals who were Caucasian and African American, but we did not meet our recruitment goals for Hispanic individuals. And so those who are kind of more chatty and willing to kind of offer a lot of detail and more comments about their food preferences may have been different than those who were not. So we may not have those individuals' preferences recorded as well. And the comments provided for this study really only reflect the experiences of participants in communities located on the East Coast. So before we get into some of the strategies you can use to implement person-centered dining, I just want to point you to a couple of resources on the PELI website that could help you in this endeavor. So the first is the Ensuring Resident Choice tip sheet. And so that is not specific to food preferences, but it's all of the PELI resources are really focused on person-centered care. So this really could kind of facilitate some of your work in creating a person-centered dining community. The next is the Honoring Preferences When the Choice Involves Risks toolkit. So that involves a toolkit, a tip sheet, and a training video, and that is also on the PELI website. And that website is preference-based-living.com. And so that's really important. I think it's really relative to this discussion because we all know that sometimes food preferences can be risky. And so it's really important to kind of use these strategies to try to navigate some of those situations and still honor preferences, but try to make it as safe as possible for the individuals. And some other important resources are the new dining practice standards put out by the Pioneer Network, and I believe Amy will go into those in a little more detail. The Pioneer Network also put out a tip sheet on flexible dining services, so that's about implementing flexible dining times. And they have a series called Pathways to Transforming Dining. So if you look at that resource after the webinar, you will see that many of the implementation suggestions that we're going to provide here in a minute really do map onto some of the steps that they say you should take to transform that dining experience and honor preferences in your communities. So we'll start kind of looking at some of these implementation strategies by considering 3 elements of person-centered dining, and they are communication, culture, and continuity. And just in a little fun way, we kind of talk about them as the 3 C's of person-centered dining. And so the first one is communication strategies. And so first, I'll talk a little bit about the 6 food preference questions on the PELI NH and how you can use those to assess and understand residents' food preferences. And this is exactly what we did for the Bone of Contention study. And then Amy will take over and she'll talk about some of the other strategies, including the use of food committees and food fairs. So as we mentioned earlier, here are the 6 questions. There is one MDS Section F question, and that is, how important is it to you to have snacks available between meals? And these 6 questions are designed to really be manageable, but you can still solicit quite a bit of information on preferences in a range of areas related to food preferences. So each of the 6 questions contains nested questions, as you can see on this slide. So if an individual answers that an item is very important, somewhat important, or important but can't do, or they feel like they have no choice, then the interviewer is instructed to ask the nested questions. And so this design is really helpful because it provides you these core questions where you can assess the importance of an item, but then you also have an opportunity to ask these follow-up, more detailed questions only on the ones that are important. So this question here is, how important is it to you to choose what to eat? And as you can see in the nested section, there's an opportunity to talk about favorite foods for the different meal times, as well as favorite drinks, condiments, and even an area to talk about foods I dislike. Another question is, do you have certain ethnic or cultural food preferences? And in our experience, that individuals will often offer more information that's even asked in these nested questions. So there's an opportunity to record any of that extra information, and that's where some of these really great quotes came from, or really meaningful and kind of powerful and enlightening quotes came from in our study. So consider incorporating these 6 food questions into your move-in processes to really get important detail on the food preferences from day 1. So you can use the 6 food preferences on the PELI on their own, and to do that, you would just navigate to preferencebasedliving.com, and you would click on the PELI Tools tab that's at the top of the website, and download the PELI NH Full, and there will be several versions of the PELI on that site that pops up. So make sure you download the full one, and then the food preference questions are questions 35 to 40. So that is it from me, and I'll hand it over to Amy, who will have, I'm sure, some great insight into some more of these communication strategies, and as well as some strategies to talk about promoting a person-centered dining culture and how you can continue or sustain these practices in your communities.
Chelsea, thank you very, very much, and Katie, thank you as well. As I shared, I'm honored to be participating with both of you and everybody that is attending this webinar today. I will tell you that the first time that I spoke with Katie and Chelsea after I had an opportunity to read the findings of this report, one of the statements that I made was that I was disheartened by some of the comments that we heard from the residents that participated in this study. What it shows is that we have a lot of work to do in our senior living profession, and I think that that's something that we need to take to heart seriously. I just want to share with you one comment, and it's a statement that I make a lot of time when I give a lot of presentations, and it has to do with the dining experience. Because again, the dining experience is not about just the food that's placed in front of us. It's about the entire experience of that whole meal, from the service level, from what it looks like onto the plate, how it tastes, and again, that social interaction, which we just heard Chelsea talk about as well. So one of the questions, and obviously we're not all together and we can't raise our hands, but I want you to think about this on an individual basis. For many of us, depending how long you've worked in senior living, think about your community and the food that you provide on a daily basis. And I want you to answer honestly to yourself. How many of you would be willing to eat every meal for the rest of your life in your community? And if you can proudly answer yes to that, then I always ask people to raise their hand. Last week I did this when I was teaching a group of administrators in training. They were at the core of knowledge, and I asked them to do so, and out of 48 people, I think there were maybe 3 that raised their hands. And as I said, that right there just tells us we have a lot of work to do. So in thinking about all of those comments that we've been talking about for the last 45 minutes or so, or last 40 minutes or so, so much of it is these residents feel, or many of them feel like they're not receiving choices. And in some instances, I will go back to what those old regulations were, because a number of residents almost referenced them. They basically said, let's say roast beef was the main and fish, was the alternate. Well, if those are my 2 options, that's not really a choice, especially if I'm not a person that eats a lot of red meat and I've never really been a fan of seafood. So what is the best way for us to get this information from our residents? And the more opportunities that we have to communicate with them to ascertain what their choices are and their preferences are is very important. So in addition to meeting with them one-on-one, using the PELI, using other diet history forms or whatever it is that you may do at your communities, offering an opportunity for a food committee. Many of us are familiar. We all have resident councils in our senior living, at least in our skilled nursing communities. But those resident councils address many different things that are going on. When you have a separate food committee, all you're doing is focusing on the dining experience. And so you're offering this up to all residents, and staff can participate as well. We can bring our cooks or our chefs in if we want. We can bring our dining service team in if we so choose. And with resident council, a lot of times it is a select group of individuals that are attending. And yes, it's true that their voice is supposed to speak for everyone that lives there. But sometimes there are personal preferences that are shared. So in a food committee, everybody is invited. It gives everybody the opportunity to share. Now, I will say that when we started our food committees, we did have to have some almost ground rules of, if this is all going to be individual preferences, we are happy to come and meet with you one-on-one to discuss those. But, please share with us, what you hear from the people that join you at your table, or maybe some of your friends as you're at another activity, or, just in your neighborhood. What are some of the things that you hear? Because it gives people opportunities to share. And again, one of the other things that I can tell you from my organization, we have communities primarily in Ohio, but they're all over Ohio. And we have some very significant food preferences. We have a community that sits in Sandusky, Ohio. And so they are people that many of them grew up fishing. So guess what? They like fish, and they want to see fish on their menu more often. We also have communities that are in very rural areas, farming type communities, who are very happy with give me that meat, potato, vegetable. So knowing the preferences of the community, knowing that there may be other people living in that community with other preferences as well, but this gives us an opportunity to discuss them as a group. It also gives you the opportunity of communicating how you're trying to meet all of their needs. So this is also a great opportunity. What we started doing a number of years ago is when we are in the process of writing new menus before we go to actually complete those spreadsheets and put them out there, we take the menus to the food committee and let them take a look at them. And I'm kind of talking, for those of us in food service, we sometimes refer to that week at a glance menu. And that's the menu that's going to get the main menu. But we also use food committee as a way to update all those extra foods we have in our everyday choice or our a la carte menus. Let's go to the next slide. Here is another opportunity in addition to food committees. So please utilize your food vendor. Reach out to your food vendor. And again, I can't state that hopefully they're all going to be willing to do this for you. But the food vendor that we use has put on what we like to refer to as food fairs. So it's an opportunity for you to incorporate not only the dining department, but other departments in your community. Invite as many residents and staff, quite honestly, if you would like, to attend this food fair where vendors will bring in, and usually you could have up to, potentially 12 different items that you might be trying. So if, let's say that, as the dining director, administrator, whomever from the community maybe went and attended a recent food show, and they saw all of these new items, or they've been reading the magazines and they know all of these new food profiles and all of these different foods that they would like to try, but you're a little unsure whether or not your residents would like them. I'll even give you an easy one. For many of us that grew up along the years, if we wanted tomato soup, it was plain tomato soup with a grilled cheese or chili. Well, nowadays you go to many restaurants and it'll be tomato basil soup. Again, maybe not something that some of our residents would have ate when they were growing up and providing food for their own families. So a few years ago at one of our food fairs, a vendor actually brought in a few soups, a butternut squash soup and a tomato basil soup. And anyway, however many foods it is that you're going to offer, you also have a short little survey at the end that lists all of the food items that you try, and you give the residents the opportunity to say, was it great, was it good, was it fair, was it poor, and would I like to see this on a menu in the future, yes or no? Excellent ways for you to obtain their feedback live time, and then you can take that information and incorporate it into the menus. It also gives you an opportunity to educate the residents through these food committees and food fairs as to what some of the new food trends are that are out there. I like to laugh and say, and this was again many years ago, but it was kind of in the past, we had always served spaghetti with meat sauce, and then it was moving into some of the baked rotinis, or we attempted to put tortellini on the menu, thinking who wouldn't like cheese-filled pasta? And the residents they weren't familiar with it, they didn't know how to pronounce it, and so again, it wasn't something that they wanted. So here we took something upon ourselves, and this was well over 20 years ago, And after one run through, we decided that just it wasn't the time, and so we took it off the menu. There were other items, and so then you learn through this process of creating the food committee that, we need to incorporate these. And guess what? At food committees and food fairs, we can even make some of these foods, have them try them, and then if they give you that feedback, they like them, then incorporate them into the menus. Next slide, please. So, additional strategies, and this is all incorporating culture change because we're seeking that information that's so vitally important for our residents. So again, as you're incorporating, information in from our residents, as we transition to the way that we need to provide and offer dining services, we also need very much to incorporate our staff in this. If we are looking to go from that tray line method of service and move to a restaurant-style dining, that is going to have a dramatic change in how the dining staff do their daily duties or the things that we are asking of them. So incorporate them and bring them in the brainstorming and the dreaming of what this vision is going to be that we're creating. Gives you that opportunity to provide education along the way. A lot of times when we were looking to enhance the dining experience, we put together a PowerPoint presentation and we explained these are some of the new trends that we are seeing as we've moved away from tray line. It started out as buffet. It's kind of transferred into restaurant-style dining. For some, there's even family-style dining in small different communities. And so these are what are going on. What do we think is going to work here? But more importantly, what would our residents like to see? And quite honestly, it always comes down to they just want choices. So you inquire about those different types of experiences. And quite honestly, I encourage you, what we did many years ago was when we knew that we needed to raise the bar, I reached out to our food vendor and several other networking partners that I know and basically just said, can you tell me some of the organizations that are providing dining experiences such as this? And then we went on a road show and we went and we toured some of these communities and luckily found people that were willing to share a lot of information. Next slide, please. So as we continue to, talk to the staff and get them involved in how we can transition and make these changes, I think it's also important for us. We don't often enough with the residents that we serve. We need to. What I like to tell our staff is, I want you to put yourself in their shoes. What's it like if you're the one that's your resident room, that's your seat in the dining room? What is it with your own food preferences? That kind of goes back to that question of, would I be happy if I ate here every meal for the rest of my life? So talking about the foods that are important to us. I also want to go back, and Chelsea had recently, in one of her last slides, she made that comment about the meatloaf, if meatloaf was something that was important to you. One other thing that we need to think about is that we do have standardized recipes and that there is consistency in the food that we are serving. And I give this example because many years ago, meatloaf is a recipe and is a food that many people do really enjoy. However, if you have one cook that makes the meatloaf one way and you have another cook that the next month makes it a different way, you're going to get inconsistent feedback from your residents, and it's really sad when the resident can say, well, when so-and-so is cooking, I really like the meatloaf, but when somebody else is cooking it, I don't want the meatloaf, so who's cooking today? Our residents pick up on these things. They will notice the taste difference, and so that's why it is so important that we are following those standardized recipes. So when you talk to staff about their own food preferences, it makes it a little more relatable to all of the residents that have their preferences as well. I think it's very important that, for those of us that have made significant changes in person-centered dining and how we provide the dining in our communities, we still have to go and make sure that we're observing on a very consistent and regular basis. Residents change over time. The people that are coming and going in some of our communities, maybe in our more rehab areas, they want things done a little bit different than in the long-term community neighborhoods within the community. It would be very different even if it's in an assisted living. So making sure that we're observing, not necessarily trying to micromanage a process, but having a good communication with the staff. And if you're noticing that there's areas for improvement, that we all sit down together to communicate. I will tell you that you're going to get the best result when you include them in it. To be the manager and just show up and watch the dining experience, and maybe for whatever reason it didn't go so well today, and then to share that and then just move on, you need to involve them in the process. Many of them are the ones that are doing it day to day. So a learning circle, I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, but again, you can look that up. The Pioneer Network website will give you a lot of information on learning circles. It will also even give you questions that you can ask to get started on learning circles. But it's an opportunity for whichever staff that you are working with, that everybody has a voice. And it's important that, just like our residents, that our staff has a voice in what it is that we're doing here as well. So that gives them an opportunity. And you don't have crosstalk and you don't interrupt. You let everybody go around and share what they think their thoughts are. And then once everybody has spoken, then you can have open dialogue going back and forth. Next slide, please. So one of the other things that I just want to share with you is that as we talk about person-directed living, as we're talking about all of these choices and making sure that we're adding choices and that we're enhancing the dining experience, sometimes it can sound a little overwhelming. Sometimes we may think, well, we can't do that. We don't have the budget for that. Or we may think that, well, I'm not going to be able to do that for whatever reason. Well, I want you to know that, small steps can make a very big difference. And yes, you have to find what's going to work for your community. But I want you to know that, we can't use, well, the regulations aren't going to allow me to do this. Because quite honestly, with those requirements of participation that were released in 2016 and started going into effect in November of 2016 and more in November 28th of 2017, now the regulations are regulating it. So choices do matter. And I wanted to share with you, so even if you were to look specifically, the F800 is the Food and Nutrition Services section of where you start to get to the regulations with dining services. And I'm going to read to you that, menus, which is F803, the old tags used to say menus must meet the nutritional requirements of residents in accordance with basically the national guidelines, be prepared in advance and be followed. But with the new regulations came all of these other terms and clauses. They must reflect, based on the facility's reasonable efforts, the religious, cultural, and ethnic needs of the resident population, as well as input received from residents and resident groups. They must be updated periodically. They must be reviewed by the community's dietitian or another clinically qualified nutrition professional. And nothing in this paragraph should be construed to limit the resident's right to make personal dietary choices. So for those of us that have been, advocating culture change and person-directed care for many years, we were actually pretty thrilled to see some of these changes in the regulations, because this is telling us that, yes, you do need to offer choice. And you can go to those regulations, and it will quite honestly even give you the definition of, well, just exactly what is a reasonable effort, okay? But it is meaning that we are assessing individual resident needs and preferences and demonstrating actions to meet those needs and preferences. In addition to that, we use the dining practice standards, which Chelsea mentioned on several occasions. These are also available. You can go to the Pioneer Network website. You can just, whatever search engine you use, you can just put in dining practice standards and it will pull it up. It's a 61-page document that gives wonderful information and talks to you with these 10 dining practice standards, many of those talking about individualized mechanically altered diet, individualized consistent carbohydrate diet. It's all about diet liberalization and being able to still accommodate resident needs, but also be able to kind of meet them in the middle with the foods that we're providing. We could go to the next slide, please. So again, as you're inquiring about these resident dining experiences outside of the community, as when you have these conversations with residents, and again, this is even with your staff or with you yourself, what are those dining experience that really made a positive experience for you? Think about like the best dining experience you've had. Many of us can also think of a poor dining experience that we've had. So having a good open communication with your residents is key. If somebody is upset with you, we accidentally burned that meatloaf we were talking about earlier, and so if there's something going on, the best thing you can do is talk to that resident about it right away. Find another alternate that you can provide to them so that they're being given choice, so that again you're basically using that service recovery right away to make sure that you're pleasing the resident the best you can. Ask about what it is that they enjoy from the current dining experience. Ask them what it is that they could see improvement in. And then, again, through these food committees, through these one-on-one experiences and opportunities for conversation that you have with them, for some residents, we have taken they've given us recipes, and we've incorporated the recipes in our menus, events, at certain parties that we may have. And quite honestly, the residents absolutely love being able to share that. And for many of them, there was something special about that as well. Some of these things are not going to affect your budget in that large of a way. You're incorporating somebody's recipe. There was something else that was going to be served at that time as well. Maybe it's something like playing some soft, soothing music. Again, background music, not taking over the dining room so that residents can't have conversation and socialization with those that are dining with them. And for some communities, family style is also appropriate and enjoyed by those residents. Next slide. So as we get to these last continuity areas that we want to talk about, one of the most important things that we need to do our best is that, when we have staff that know our residents, they know their preferences, they know what it is that their residents enjoy and how they like their meal, the more consistent staff that you can have in meal times in those dining rooms is what's going to give you the best overall satisfaction of those residents. So it does take all elements to come together to create that dining experience that we want. We want to make sure that, all of the leadership team, is in agreement of where it is that we want to go to offer person-directed and person-centered dining. This is not going to happen overnight. It's going to take some time. We need to involve a number of people in the process. We're going to have some patience. And it may not always go great right out of the gate, but that doesn't mean that you just don't go back and talk about it and then seek information from those involved and how we can make it better the next time we do it. So start with those some of those smaller changes, and then it eventually will move on to make a bigger impact. I think one of the biggest things that we need to realize is we do need to make sure that we celebrate our successes and that we celebrate those together as a team, whatever it is that's going to mean. That's what's going to be the most meaningful. So I think the key is, as we've shared, is that, it's up to us to make this dining experience. We're the ones that are providing it. So when we've heard all of this feedback from the residents that they want choice, and they want choice in what they're eating, when they're eating, where they're eating, we need to have those conversations with them, and then we need to make sure we're sharing this with all team members to be able to make that happen. At this time, we'd like to open up and listen, hear your questions, and answer in any way that we can.
Thank you, Amy. That was fantastic. And thank you, Chelsea. That was just a great overview and some wonderful suggestions. One of the things that has come up is, could you talk a little bit more about the ground rules that you had to put in place for your food committee? So some people are concerned that these food committees would just would become a very negative and complaint-driven sort of, gripe fest, if you will. And so could you talk a little bit about how you set that up?
Sure. I'm going to talk specifically about the latest community that we did this with. And quite honestly, we met with all of our residents. We actually shared a PowerPoint presentation and talked about, all of these different dining trends that were going on, and we had listened to their feedback and some of their concerns, and that we wanted to make sure we were trying to find ways to meet their concerns. And some of those at the time was, just with the level of some of the assistance some residents were needing and making sure that food was hot and that service was timely. And then for some of them, it was specifics about the food. So a lot of it is education. Sometimes in the past at food committees, we've had residents saying, I'm so tired of the carrots and broccoli, and why do you serve those on such a regular basis? We like green beans and corn. Well, guess what? That was a great opportunity to educate residents that, there still is a clause in the regulations that states that we need to make sure that our menus are meeting the nutritional adequacy of the Food and Nutrition Board. And we do need to provide a vitamin A source 3 times a week and a vitamin C source on a daily basis. And so that is why sometimes there are going to be foods that maybe they're not going to be your favorites, but they will be on the menu. Now, that is why also on our a la carte menus, we do have other choices of vegetables that are available. So by incorporating those, we provided an education, but then we also listen to them about what are some of the vegetables you do like, and we make those available more often on an everyday menu, or what we like to refer to as our a la carte menu. Those ground rules are going to come down to, and I think the biggest thing is, if somebody a resident wants to go on and on about specific preferences, it is okay to intervene and just say, it sounds like this is starting to become things that are more specific to you and what your needs and wants are, and so we are going to come and meet with you individually in your room or wherever you would like to meet, and we'll have a discussion of those so that we can do that for you. Our food committee as a group is, here we are trying to take, not everybody wants to come to these meetings, but we do know that there's a lot of people that will be willing to share feedback, whether you're all together at the table or when you're just talking at another location or time. And so please bring that feedback that is going to, you're kind of helping speak for everybody here at the community. And so those were kind of our ground rules of just knowing that, personal preferences matter, but quite honestly, we can talk to you one-on-one about your personal preferences.
Wonderful. Thank you, Amy. And
sure.
Yeah, and so we have one last quick question, and then what I'll do is I'll share the link for those of you who also need to sign out. I know that it is 3 o'clock. How do things change when you start cooking food directly in kitchens and households?
Well, quite honestly, we have seen a dramatic increase in satisfaction from our residents when we were able to do that. And granted, this does take a little bit of time and planning, because you might be planning with your, to be able to, number one, create those households, or to create the opportunity and bring in that equipment that you can make that happen. Generally, your service is going to, you have to do education on the service that you're going to provide, but generally you're providing a restaurant style of choice. You're going to be asking the resident at the point of service what it is they want to eat. You're not going by the likes and dislikes that they may have provided coming in on a diet history or a PELI intake form. You have the food that's right there. So number one, if the food is in that steam table, you're going to have the aromas of the food that are going to be drifting into the dining area, which helps to increase the appetite. Quite honestly, when you see that steam, if you're able to see that steam coming, if the steam table is visible and you see that steam, you know right then and there it's going to be hot. And if the food is coming from that household and going right into the dining room, it's not having to travel down halls in carts or whatever the situation may be for your specific community. So I think right then and there, again, those are too huge, because where a lot of times that we hear thing is we don't feel like we have a choice in the food, and or maybe the temperature isn't where it needs to be, or I didn't have an opportunity for choice. Here I can put a menu in front of you just like I go to a restaurant and I see all the choices available to me.
Fantastic. Thanks again, Amy. And thanks, everybody, for joining us for our webinar. And again, we want to thank our presenters, Amy Cotterman and Chelsea Goldstein, for joining us in our webinar. And again, thank you all for attending the webinar. Have a great rest of your day.